the sun-drenched alleys of 1950s Lisbon, where secrets whisper through cobbled streets, Miss Jane Marple arrives for a quiet holiday. But when a sly art dealer is found stabbed in a shadowy fado bar, her keen eye unravels a web of blackmail, forged paintings, and hidden loves. From elegant villas to bustling cafes, she pieces together clues: Colonel Blake's evasions, Clara's sharp anger, Sylvia's nervous secrets, and a doctor's deadly precision. In just days, Miss Marple exposes a killer, proving that even in Lisbon's vibrant heart, no secret escapes her gentle, unyielding gaze. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Lisbon, in the quiet village of Danefield, where the hedgerows bloomed with late autumn roses and the church bell tolled with comforting regularity. Miss Jane Marple sat in her small, Hull-sunlit parlour. Her delicate hands, still nimble despite the faint lines of age, moved rhythmically over a skein of pale blue wool, the click of her knitting needles a gentle counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. The room was a picture of modest order, chintz curtains framing the windows, a well-worn armchair by the hearth, and a small mahogany table bearing a single letter, its envelope slit open with care. The letter, postmarked from Lisbon, had arrived that morning, and its contents had stirred something in Miss Marple's usually tranquil mind. It was from Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves, a friend from her schoolgirl days, whose spirited nature had not dimmed with the years. Eleanor had married a diplomat, Mr. Charles Hargreaves, and after his retirement they had settled in a charming villa in Lisbon's Alfama district. The letter was written in Eleanor's characteristic flourish, full of vivid descriptions of cobbled streets, sun-drenched terraces, and the haunting strains of fado music that drifted through the city at night. "Come to Lisbon, dear Jane," she had written, "and let this old city enchant you. The streets here seem to whisper secrets, and I long for your company to share them. My friends are a lively bunch, some English, some Portuguese, and one rather mysterious Frenchman. A fortnight with us will do you good, and I promise you'll find no end of interesting characters to observe." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile as she set her knitting aside. Secrets, she thought, had a way of revealing themselves, much like a dropped stitch in a carefully knitted scarf. She had seen it often enough in Danefield, where village gossip, so innocently begun, could unravel hidden truths, jealousies, betrayals, even crimes. Lisbon, with its labyrinthine alleys and cosmopolitan air, promised to be no less revealing. The decision was made with her usual quiet resolve. She rose, smoothed her tweed skirt, and began to pack a modest suitcase. 2 sensible dresses, a shawl for cool evenings, and her trusty knitting bag. Her nephew Raymond, ever solicitous, had arranged her travel. A train to London, followed by a flight to Lisbon, a modern contraption she approached with mild suspicion but no real fear. As she locked her cottage door, she cast a glance at the village green, where Mrs. Bantry was scolding her terrier for digging in the flower beds. Danefield would manage without her for a while, she thought, though she wondered what small dramas might unfold in her absence. The journey was uneventful, save for the chatter of a young couple on the plain, whose animated talk of Lisbon's nightlife contrasted sharply with Miss Marple's own expectations of quiet evenings and Eleanor's lively but refined gatherings. As the plane descended over Lisbon, she peered through the window at the city below. The Tagus River glinted like a ribbon of silver, and the terracotta roofs of the old quarters sprawled beneath the 7 hills, their tiles catching the late afternoon sun. The sight stirred a flicker of anticipation in her. Cities, like villages, were tapestries of human nature, and Miss Marple had long ago learned to read their patterns. At the airport, Eleanor Hargreaves awaited her, as vibrant as her letters promised. Her greying hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her eyes sparkled with warmth as she enveloped Miss Marple in a hug. "Jane, you haven't changed a bit," she exclaimed, though Miss Marple knew this was kindly exaggeration. "Come, let's get you to the villa. You'll love Rua das Sombras. It's the quaintest street in Alfama, though the name does sound a touch ominous, doesn't it?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Shadows often hide the most interesting things, Eleanor." The drive to the villa wound through Lisbon's steep, narrow streets, where laundry fluttered from wrought-iron balconies, and the scent of grilled sardines mingled with the salt of the sea. Eleanor's villa was a charming affair, its whitewashed walls adorned with blue and yellow azulejo tiles, its windows framed by bougainvillea. Inside, the rooms were a blend of English coziness and Portuguese flair. Mahogany furniture sat alongside vibrant rugs, and a portrait of Eleanor's late husband hung above a tiled fireplace. As Miss Marple settled into her guest room, she gazed out at the street below, where an old man played a melancholy tune on an accordion. The notes seemed to carry a story of their own, and Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of curiosity. Eleanor had promised interesting characters, and Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human foibles, suspected that Lisbon's whispering streets held more than mere charm. They held secrets that in her experience rarely stayed silent for long. Chapter 2. The House on Rua das Sombras. Miss Jane Marple descended the polished wooden staircase of Eleanor Hargreaves's villa, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the steps. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting dappled light across the azulejo tiles that lined the entrance hall. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine from the courtyard, mingled with the richer aroma of brewing coffee. Eleanor, ever the gracious hostess, had arranged a small gathering to welcome her old friend to Lisbon, and Miss Marple, with her quiet curiosity, looked forward to meeting the cast of characters Eleanor had described in her letters. The drawing-room was a charming blend of cultures. A sturdy English sofa sat beside a low Portuguese table inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and a crystal decanter of port gleamed on a sideboard. Eleanor, resplendent in a silk shawl, bustled about, arranging a tray of pasté de nata with the enthusiasm of a schoolgirl. "Jane, you must try these," she said, her voice bright. "They're quite the local delicacy, though I confess I've eaten far too many since we moved here." Miss Marple smiled, accepting a pastry with a murmur of thanks. Her eyes, however, were already scanning the room as the other guests arrived, each bringing with them a distinct air that she noted with the precision of a botanist cataloguing rare specimens. Human nature, she had often observed, was much the same whether in Danefield or distant Lisbon, and she had a knack for spotting the subtle quirks that revealed more than words ever could. First to arrive was Colonel Reginald Blake, a retired British officer whose broad shoulders and ruddy complexion spoke of years spent under foreign suns. His moustache was meticulously trimmed, and his voice boomed with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, shaking her hand with a grip that was firm but not unkind. Eleanor's told me you're a bit of a sleuth in your village. Not much call for that here, I hope." His laugh was hearty, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he were measuring her. She thought of Mr. Thompson, a retired major in Danefield, whose bluff exterior had once concealed a gambling debt. Next came Mrs. Clara Monteiro, a Portuguese widow whose elegance was tempered by a certain sharpness. Her black dress, though simple, was of fine silk, and a string of pearls gleamed at her throat. She greeted Miss Marple with a polite nod, her dark eyes assessing. "You are Eleanor's friend from England," she said, her accent precise. "Lisbon must seem very different from your quiet village." Her smile was courteous, but Miss Marple sensed a guardedness, like that of Mrs. Elwood back home, who had once been caught spreading malicious gossip about a neighbour. Mr. Felix Durand entered with a flourish, his French accent smooth as the silk scarf tucked into his jacket. An art dealer by trade, he had the lean, restless look of a fox, his eyes darting about the room as if cataloguing its contents. "Enchanté, Mademoiselle Marple," he said, kissing her hand with exaggerated gallantry. "Lisbon is a city of treasures, and I hope you will find it as captivating as I do." His charm was polished, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers toyed with a gold cufflink, a nervous habit she had seen in a Deanfield shopkeeper caught selling stolen goods. Miss Sylvia Crane, Eleanor's young English secretary, was a contrast to the others. Her fair hair was neatly pinned, but her hands trembled slightly as she offered Miss Marple a cup of tea. "I hope you're settling in, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but strained. She seemed barely 25, with the anxious air of a girl carrying a burden too heavy for her slight frame. Miss Marple thought of young Annie from Danefield, who had once been in love with a man her family disapproved of, and wondered what secret weighed on Sylvia's mind. The final guest was Dr. Antonio Pereira, a local physician whose quiet demeanour stood in stark contrast to the room's livelier personalities. His dark suit was immaculate, and his manner was reserved, almost scholarly. "A pleasure to meet you," he said, his voice low and measured. He spoke of Lisbon's history with a passion that intrigued Miss Marple, though she noted how his eyes lingered on Felix Durand with a hint of wariness. She recalled Dr. Hayworth, a Danefield physician who had once been too quick to sign a questionable death certificate, and filed the observation away. The conversation flowed as easily as the port, with Colonel Blake regaling the group with tales of his campaigns in India, and Clara Monteiro offering wry comments on Lisbon's social scene. Felix Durand spoke of a recent art auction, his words laced with insinuations about wealthy buyers, while Sylvia remained mostly silent, her gaze fixed on her teacup. Dr. Pereira contributed little, though his occasional remarks about local legends, the ghostly whispers said to haunt Alfama's streets, drew a shiver from Eleanor. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple's keen senses detected an undercurrent of tension beneath the polite chatter. Colonel Blake's laughter grew louder after his third glass of port, but his eyes darted to Felix when the art dealer mentioned a questionable transaction. Clara's smile tightened when Felix complimented her taste in paintings, and Sylvia's teacup rattled in its saucer when Felix addressed her directly. Dr. Pereira, meanwhile, watched the room with the detachment of a scientist observing an experiment, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. Later, As the guests departed and Miss Marple retired to her room, she paused by the open window. The night air was cool, carrying the distant strains of a fado singer from a nearby tavern. Below, in the shadowed courtyard, she overheard a sharp exchange between Clara and Felix. "You think you can hold that over me?" Clara hissed, her voice low but fierce. "That painting was your doing, not mine." Felix's reply was smooth, almost mocking. "My dear Clara, secrets are like art, valuable only when someone is willing to pay for them." The voices faded as they moved out of earshot, but Miss Marple stood still, her hands folded, neatly. The words painting and secrets lingered in her mind, like threads waiting to be woven into a pattern. She thought of a similar incident in Danefield, where a forged antique had led to bitter accusations among neighbours. Blackmail, she knew, was a dangerous game, and those who played it often found themselves entangled in knots of their own making. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the group she had met. Each carried a hint of something unspoken. Colonel Blake's forced joviality, Clara's sharp defensiveness, Felix's sly confidence, Sylvia's nervous glances, and Dr. Pereira's quiet watchfulness. Lisbon, with its whispering streets, was proving as intricate as Eleanor had promised. Miss Marple closed her eyes, her mind already tracing the outlines of a puzzle that she suspected would soon demand her full attention. Chapter 3. The Body in the Fado Bar. The evening air in Lisbon's Barro Alto was thick with the scent of grilled octopus, and the mournful strains of fado, that peculiarly Portuguese music that seemed to weave sorrow and longing into every note. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small candlelit table in the cramped interior of a Noite Silenciosa, a renowned fado bar, adjusted her shawl and observed her surroundings with her usual unobtrusive keenness. Eleanor Hargreaves had insisted on this outing, declaring it a quintessential Lisbon experience, and Miss Marple, ever open to new impressions, had agreed with a quiet nod. The bar was a dimly lit haven of polished wood and faded photographs, its walls adorned with images of singers whose eyes seemed to follow the patrons with silent reproach. The group from the previous evening's gathering at Rua das Sombras was present, though their number was one short. Colonel Reginald Blake sat to Miss Marple's left, his broad frame slightly hunched as he sipped a glass of ruby-red port, his eyes fixed on the singer. A young woman whose voice trembled with emotion, Mrs. Clara Montero, elegant in a dark shawl, sat opposite, her fingers tapping restlessly on the tablecloth, her gaze darting to the door as if expecting an unwelcome arrival. Miss Sylvia Crane, pale and fidgety, clutched a glass of water, her eyes downcast, while Dr. Antonio Pereira, ever reserved, leaned back in his chair, his face half-shadowed by the flickering candlelight. Felix Durant, the art dealer, had not joined them, a fact that Eleanor had remarked upon with mild surprise. "He promised to come," she said, her brow furrowing. "It's not like Felix to miss an evening out." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, Eleanor had thoughtfully requested it from the barman, noted the subtle tensions among the group. The Colonel's joviality seemed strained, his laughter at the singer's performance a touch too loud. Clara's sharp eyes missed nothing, yet she avoided looking at Sylvia, who seemed to shrink further into herself with each passing minute. Dr. Pereira's silence was not the comfortable quiet of a man at ease, but rather the stillness of one listening for something others could not hear. Miss Marple thought of a village concert in Danefield, where a similar undercurrent of unease had preceded a public quarrel, and she wondered what lay beneath tonight's civility. The photo singer's voice rose, a haunting lament about a lost lover, and the room fell into a reverent hush. It was then that Dr. Pereira excused himself, murmuring something about needing air. He slipped out through the heavy curtain that separated the bar from the narrow alley beyond. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, noting the way his shoulders stiffened as he passed the barman, who was polishing glasses with a distracted air. She recalled a Danefield doctor who had once stepped out during a church service, only to be found later concealing a personal indiscretion. Minutes passed, the singer's voice weaving its spell, when a sudden commotion broke the trance. The curtain was flung aside, and Dr. Pereira reappeared, his face ashen, his hands trembling slightly. "Eleanor," he said in a low, urgent voice, "there's trouble outside. A man, dead, in the alley." A gasp rippled through the group. Colonel Blake's glass clinked sharply against the table, and Sylvia let out a small, stifled cry. Clara's lips tightened, but she said nothing, her fingers stilling on the tablecloth. Eleanor, ever practical, stood at once. "We must fetch the police," she said, her voice steady despite the shock in her eyes. Miss Marple, with the unhurried calm that often disguised her sharp curiosity, rose and followed the group as they moved toward the alley. The barman, now alert, had already telephoned the authorities, and a small crowd of patrons gathered at the entrance, their whispers blending with the distant wail of a siren. The alley was narrow, its cobbled stones slick with evening dew, and there, slumped against a wall beneath a flickering street lamp, lay Felix Durand. His silk scarf was askew, and a dark stain spread across his chest, the glint of a knife's handle barely visible in the dim light. His eyes, once sharp with cunning, stared blankly at the starless sky. Capitan Almeida, a stern, broad-shouldered police inspector with a moustache that seemed to bristle with authority, arrived swiftly with 2 constables. He barked orders in rapid Portuguese, cordoning off the alley and shooing back the curious onlookers. Miss Marple, standing just beyond the tape, observed with her usual unobtrusive care. The inspector knelt beside the body, his gloved hands careful as he examined the scene. "Stabbed," he muttered to a constable. "A single thrust, clean through the heart. No sign of a struggle." He rose and turned to the group, his dark eyes narrowing. "You knew this man?" he asked, his English accented but precise. Eleanor, pale but composed, nodded. "Mr. Felix Durand, an art dealer. He was a friend, well, an acquaintance. He was meant to join us tonight." The inspector's gaze swept over the group, lingering on each face. Colonel Blake cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Haven't seen him since yesterday. Fine fellow. Bit of a rogue, perhaps, but no harm in him." His words were hearty, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand gripped his cane, the knuckles whitening. Clara Montero spoke next, her voice cool. "Felix was complicated. I saw him at Eleanor's villa last night, but not today." Her eyes met the inspector's without flinching, though Miss Marple caught the faintest tremor in her clasped hands. Sylvia, when questioned, stammered, her voice barely audible. I don't know. I didn't see him after the party." Her eyes darted to the ground, and Miss Marple thought of a Danefield girl who had lied about a stolen bracelet, her guilt betrayed by just such a glance. Dr. Pereira, calm now, explained that he had stepped out for a cigarette and found the body. "I checked for a pulse," he said, his voice steady. "There was none. I came straight back to tell the others." The inspector nodded, but Miss Marple noted that Pereira's cigarette case, visible in his pocket, was unopened, its silver surface gleaming untouched. As the police continued their work, Miss Marple slipped back into the bar, her mind already threading together the evening's observations. Felix's wallet, she had overheard, was untouched, ruling out robbery. The precision of the wound suggested intent, not impulse, and the absence of a struggle hinted at a killer known to the victim. She thought of the overheard conversation between Clara and Felix, the words blackmail and painting sharp in her memory. Back at the villa, as Eleanor poured brandy to steady everyone's nerves, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. A murder, she reflected, was like a tapestry with a hidden flaw. One had only to tug at the right thread to reveal the pattern beneath. Felix Durant, with his sly smiles and whispered secrets, had likely tugged at too many threads. As she glanced at the group, Colonel Blake's forced calm, Clara's rigid poise, Sylvia's trembling hands, and Pereira's watchful silence, she knew the answer lay among them. Lisbon's whispering streets had spoken, and Miss Marple was listening. Chapter 4. Whispers of Motive. The morning after the grim discovery in the alley, the villa on Rua das Sombras was steeped in a quiet unease, as if the very walls held their breath. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her teacup cradled in her hands, her eyes moving gently over the faces of her companions. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows did little to dispel the pall that had settled over the group. Eleanor Hargreaves, ever the steadfast hostess, attempted to keep the conversation light, remarking on the beauty of Lisbon's autumn skies. But her voice faltered under the weight of the previous night's events. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air, sipped her tea and listened as Eleanor shared what she knew of Felix Durant. "He came to Lisbon about 2 years ago," she said, buttering a slice of Pão de Milho with a distracted air. "An art dealer, you know, but not the sort you'd find in reputable galleries. He had a knack for finding paintings, beautiful ones, mind you, but there was always a whisper of something shady about them. I never asked too many questions." Colonel Blake, seated across the table, snorted softly. "Shady's the word for it. Fellow was always sniffing around for a deal, wasn't he? Made a fortune, I'd wager, though you'd never know it from his flashy suits." His tone was gruff, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward the window, as if to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. She thought of Mr. Carver, a Danefield merchant who had spoken similarly of a rival before his own shady dealings came to light. Clara Montero, who had joined them despite the early hour, stirred her coffee with a delicate silver spoon. "Felix was a nuisance," she said, her voice crisp. "Always prying, always hinting he knew more than he should. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd crossed the wrong person." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the faint tightening of her jaw, a sign she had seen in Mrs. Langley, a Danefield matron who had once been caught in a lie about her husband's finances. Sylvia Crane, pale and silent, picked at her plate, her fork trembling slightly. She had barely spoken since the Fado bar, and Miss Marple observed the way her eyes darted to the door whenever footsteps echoed in the hall. Dr. Pereira, The last to arrive took his seat with a quiet nod, his expression as unreadable as ever. He murmured something about the tragedy of sudden death, but his tone lacked the warmth one might expect from a physician. Miss Marple thought of Dr. Simmons in Danefield, whose calm demeanour had masked a tendency to overprescribe sedatives to nervous patients. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple proposed a visit to Clara Montero's home that afternoon, ostensibly to admire her renowned rose garden. Eleanor, eager for a distraction, agreed at once, and Sylvia, perhaps reluctant to be left alone, offered to accompany them. Clara's residence, a grand old house in the Lapa district, was a study in understated opulence. Whitewashed walls gleamed under climbing vines, and the garden was a riot of colour, with roses in every shade from blush pink to deep crimson. Clara, proud of her blooms, led them through the paths, her shears snipping deadheads with a precision that bordered on ferocity. "These roses are my solace," Clara said, pausing to clip a wilted bloom. "After my husband passed, I found comfort in their order." Felix, though, he had no appreciation for such things, always poking into matters that didn't concern him. Her voice was light, but Miss Marple caught the edge beneath it, like a needle hidden in the soft fabric. "Oh, Felix was tiresome about art, wasn't he?" Eleanor said, attempting to keep the mood bright. "Always going on about some painting or other." Clara's shears paused mid-snip. "He sold me a Velasquez, or so he claimed," she said, her tone cool. "Cost me a small fortune, and now I hear it might be a fake. I told him he'd regret it if he'd swindled me." Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, then slid away, and Miss Marple recalled a Danefield widow who had been similarly defensive about a fraudulent investment. Sylvia, trailing behind, seemed distracted, her gaze fixed on the street beyond the garden gate. Miss Marple, with her knack for noticing small things, saw her slip a hand into her pocket and withdraw it quickly, as if checking something. Later, as they returned to the villa, Miss Marple contrived to walk close to Sylvia and glimpsed a folded note in the girl's coat pocket, bearing the words Café de Luz. She filed the detail away, thinking of a young maid in Danefield who had hidden love letters in a similar fashion. That evening, as the group gathered for a subdued dinner, Miss Marple turned the conversation to Felix's dealings. "He must have known many people in Lisbon," she said mildly, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Such a sociable man, always in the thick of things." Colonel Blake grunted, slicing into his bacalao with unnecessary force. "Too sociable, if you ask me. Always had his nose in someone's business. Heard he was mixed up with some shady types. Smugglers, maybe." His words were casual, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, much like a Danefield farmer who had once lied about a stolen horse. Dr. Pereira, cutting his fish with surgical precision, offered a vague comment about Felix's reputation. "He was known in certain circles," he said, his voice low. "Not always the best circles." His reticence reminded Miss Marple of a Danefield curate who had spoken sparingly to conceal his own indiscretions. Sylvia, meanwhile, spilled a drop of wine as she reached for her glass, her cheeks flushing. I didn't know Felix well," she stammered, though no one had asked. Miss Marple's gentle smile masked her interest in the girl's unease, which echoed a Danefield shop girl's nervousness when questioned about a missing till. As the meal ended, Miss Marple retired to her room, her mind weaving together the threads of the day. Felix's blackmail, hinted at in the courtyard, seemed to touch more than just Clara. The Velasquez, the smuggler rumours, Sylvia's hidden note, all were stitches in a pattern that was beginning to take shape. She thought of a Danefield scandal, where a seemingly trivial quarrel over a forged deed had led to a violent end, and wondered who among this group had felt Felix's threats most keenly. Sitting by the window, her knitting idle, Miss Marple gazed out at the shadowed street. The distant hum of Lisbon's nightlife mingled with the memory of the Fado singer's lament, and she felt the weight of an unseen truth. Felix Durant had been a man who traded in secrets, and secrets, she knew, were dangerous currency. Someone in this house, or perhaps just beyond it, had paid a deadly price to keep theirs hidden. Chapter 5. The Clue in the Gallery. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobbled streets of Lisbon, as Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the glare, walked arm in arm with Eleanor Hargreaves toward the heart of the Chiado district. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, and the city hummed with the quiet energy of a new day. Miss Marple had suggested a visit to Galleria de Sol, a small but reputable art gallery where Felix Durant had often conducted his business. Eleanor, eager for a distraction from the pall of murder that hung over her villa, had readily agreed. Her chatter about Lisbon's cultural treasures, a welcome contrast to the grim events of the past days. The gallery was a narrow, elegant space, its walls lined with paintings that ranged from somber religious icons to vibrant modernist works. The air smelled faintly of linseed oil and old wood, and the polished floor creaked softly underfoot. Senor Costa, the gallery's owner, greeted them with a courteous bow. He was a wiry man with sharp features and a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles, which Miss Marple noted with interest. She had known a Danefield jeweller with a similar tic, whose anxiety had betrayed his involvement in selling stolen goods. "Mrs. Hargreaves, a pleasure as always," Senor Costa said, his English accented but fluent. "And your friend, Miss Marple, is it? Welcome to my humble gallery." His smile was polite, but his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. Miss Marple, with her gentle demeanour, thanked him and began to wander among the paintings, her keen gaze taking in more than the brushstrokes. Eleanor, ever enthusiastic, admired a vivid seascape, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small, unsigned sketch in a shadowed corner, a study in charcoal and ink depicting a woman with a haunting expression. "This is striking," she said mildly, turning to Senor Costa. "One of Mr. Durant's finds, perhaps." The gallery owner hesitated, his fingers twitching at his spectacles. "Ah, yes, Felix brought that in some months ago," he said. "A Goya, or so he claimed. He was negotiating its sale, but the deal fell through." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight falter, like a stitch dropped in a careful pattern. She thought of a Danefield antique dealer who had been equally evasive when questioned about a dubious provenance. "Who was the buyer?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as innocent as if she were inquiring about the weather. Senor Costa's smile tightened. "A private collector," he said vaguely. "I don't recall the name." But his eyes flickered toward the door again, and Miss Marple made a mental note of his unease. She recalled Colonel Blake's discomfort when Felix's art dealings had been mentioned at dinner, and a suspicion began to form. delicate but persistent, like a thread waiting to be pulled. As they left the gallery, Eleanor remarked on the beauty of the Goya sketch, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She suggested a stroll through the nearby praça, where she could observe the passers-by and let her mind work on the puzzle. The square was lively with vendors and tourists, and Miss Marple, seated on a bench with her knitting in her lap, watched the world go by. She thought of a Danefield fair, where a seemingly trivial conversation had revealed a motive for theft, and wondered what the gallery's secrets might yield. That evening, back at the villa, Miss Marple contrived to sit beside Colonel Blake during a quiet moment after dinner. The others, Clara, Sylvia, and Dr. Pereira, were engaged in a subdued game of cards, their voices low in the wake of Felix's death. The Colonel, nursing a glass of sherry, seemed more relaxed than usual, his ruddy face softened by the firelight. Miss Marple, her needles clicking gently, turned the conversation to art. "I saw a lovely Goya sketch today," she said, her voice light. "At Galleria do Sol. They say Felix was trying to sell it to someone. You're a man of taste, Colonel. Do you collect such things?" The Colonel's hand paused, the sherry glass halfway to his lips. "Goya, you say?" he muttered. "Fine artist, but I'm no collector, just a passing interest." His tone was gruff, and he quickly changed the subject to the merits of Portuguese port. But Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, much like a Danefield squire who had once denied knowledge of a stolen hunting rifle. She suspected the Colonel had been the private collector Senor Costa had mentioned, and that Felix's negotiations had stirred some trouble. Later, as the card game broke up, Miss Marple observed Sylvia slipping out of the villa's front door, her coat pulled tight against the evening chill. The girl's movements were furtive, and Miss Marple, with her knack for noticing small things, recalled the note in Sylvia's pocket bearing the name of Café da Luz. She thought of a Danefield girl who had crept out at night to meet a forbidden suitor, and wondered if Sylvia's secrecy was tied to Felix's death. As she retired to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. The streets of Alfama whispered below, their cobblestones gleaming under the moonlight. She pieced together the day's observations, the Goya sketch, Senor Costa's nervousness, Colonel Blake's evasion, and Sylvia's clandestine movements. Felix's blackmail, she suspected, had extended beyond Clara's dubious Velasquez. The Colonel's interest in the dupe, Goya, and Sylvia's hidden note were threads in a larger tapestry, one woven with greed, fear, and perhaps desperation. Miss Marple thought of a Danefield scandal, where a forged painting had led to a bitter feud, and reflected on the dangers of dealing in questionable art. Felix, with his sly charm and knack for secrets, had likely pressed too hard on someone's vulnerability. The question was who? Colonel Blake, with his military precision and hidden interest in the Goya. Sylvia, with her nervous glances and secret rendezvous. Or someone else lurking just out of sight, like a shadow in Lisbon's winding streets. As she gazed out at the city, the distant sound of a fado melody drifted up, its melancholy notes echoing her thoughts. Murder, she knew, was never a solitary act. It was a knot tied by many hands, each pulling at their own threads of motive. Miss Marple's sharp mind was already tracing those threads, ready to unravel the truth hidden in the whispering streets of Lisbon. Chapter 6. the cafe, and the confession. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the villa on Rua das Sombras, casting intricate patterns across the breakfast table where Miss Jane Marple sat, her teacup cradled in her hands. The atmosphere in the house remained taut, like a tapestry stretched too tightly on its frame, and the conversation among Eleanor Hargreaves and her guests was subdued. The memory of Felix Durant's lifeless body in the alley lingered, unspoken but ever present, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed none of the small signs of strain. Colonel Blake's overly hearty laugh, Clara Montero's clipped responses, Sylvia Crane's pallor, and Dr. Antonio Pereira's measured silence. Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, had decided to follow the thread of Sylvia's secretive behaviour. The note in the girl's pocket, bearing the name Café da Luz, had piqued her curiosity, and she suggested a morning outing to the café, framing it as a chance to enjoy Lisbon's charming street life. Eleanor, eager to lift the gloom, agreed at once, and Sylvia, though hesitant, joined them, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. As they walked through Alfama's winding streets, Miss Marple noted the way Sylvia's eyes darted to every passing face, much like a Danefield girl who had once feared discovery of a forbidden romance. The Café de Luz was a modest establishment tucked into a corner of a sunlit praça, its tables spilling onto the pavement beneath a striped awning. The air was rich with the scent of espresso and warm pastel de nata, and a few locals lingered over newspapers, their voices a soft murmur against the clink of cups. Miss Marple chose a table near the edge of the terrace, her position allowing a clear view of the cafe's entrance. She ordered a pot of tea, her gentle smile masking the keen observation that had solved many a mystery in Danefield. As Eleanor chatted about the cafe's history, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Sylvia, who sat rigidly, her gaze fixed on a young waiter wiping down a nearby table. He was a handsome lad, perhaps 25, with dark curls and a nervous smile that faltered when he caught Sylvia's eye. Miss Marple noted the brief, almost imperceptible nod he gave her, and the way Sylvia's shoulders tensed in response. It reminded her of a Danefield baker's apprentice, whose stolen glances at a housemaid had betrayed a secret engagement. Pretending to adjust her shawl, Miss Marple leaned closer to Sylvia. "Such a charming place," she said mildly. "Do you come here often, Miss Crane?" Sylvia started, her teaspoon clattering against her saucer. "Oh, no, not really," she stammered. "Just now and then." Her cheeks flushed, and Miss Marple's gentle nod hid her growing certainty that the café held a key to Sylvia's unease. As Eleanor excused herself to speak with a passing acquaintance, Miss Marple seized the moment. "You seem troubled, my dear," she said softly, her voice as soothing as a village spinster comforting a nervous child. "Sometimes sharing a worry can lighten the load. I've known many a young woman in Danefield who found it so." Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she would bolt. But the girl's shoulders slumped, and in a rush of whispered words she confessed. The young waiter Joel was her fiancé, a secret she had kept from Eleanor and the others. "He's a good man," Sylvia said, her voice trembling, "but Felix found out about him, about something he did. Joel got mixed up with some men, just small things, moving goods across the border. Felix threatened to tell the police unless I paid him. I didn't have the money, but, oh, Miss Marple, I didn't kill him. I swear it." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. "I'm glad he's dead," she whispered, "but I didn't do it." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch as reassuring as her calm demeanour. There, she said, "you've done right to tell me. Secrets have a way of twisting things, but the truth is always simpler." In her mind, she saw a Danefield girl who had confessed to a similar entanglement, her fear of exposure driving her to desperation. Sylvia, she thought, was no killer. Her slight frame and tearful honesty spoke of fear, not violence. But Joan, with access to the cafe's kitchen and its array of knives, was another matter. Miss Marple filed the thought away, like a stitch held for later weaving. As they returned to the villa, Miss Marple's mind turned over Sylvia's confession. Blackmail, it seemed, was Felix's currency, and he had cast his net wide. Clara's dubious Velasquez, Colonel Blake's interest in the Goya sketch, and now Sylvia's secret engagement, each was a thread in a pattern of coercion. But who had snapped under the strain? That evening, as the group gathered in the villa's drawing room, a sombre mood prevailed. The police had sent word, via Dr. Pereira, who maintained a quiet liaison with the authorities. A bloodied knife had been found in a storm drain near the Fado Bar, its slender blade matching the wound that had killed Felix. No fingerprints were found, Capitão Almeida had reported, but the discovery sharpened the tension in the room. Colonel Blake gripped his glass of port tightly, his eyes distant. Clara's fingers toyed with her pearls, her face a mask of composure. Sylvia, still pale, avoided looking at anyone, while Dr. Pereira recounted the police's findings with clinical detachment. Miss Marple, her knitting a soft rhythm in the silence, observed them all. The knife, she thought, was a deliberate clue, discarded to mislead, yet pointing to a killer with access to such a weapon. Joan, perhaps, or someone with a physician's precision like Pereira. She recalled a Danefield murder, where a discarded tool had led to a gardener with a hidden grudge, and wondered if the answer lay in a similar misdirection. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple retired to her room, her thoughts as intricate as the lace at her window. Felix's blackmail had created a web of motives, each strand taut with fear and resentment. Sylvia's confession had revealed one thread, but others remained hidden. Colonel Blake's secretive interest in the Goya, Clara's anger over the Velasquez, and Pereira's unopened cigarette case on the night of the murder. Lisbon's whispering streets, she thought, held their secrets tightly, but Miss Marple was adept at teasing them out, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 7. The Unravelling Pattern. The villa on Rua das Sombras was cloaked in the soft glow of late afternoon, its tiled walls catching the fading light as Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, her knitting needles still in her hands. The rhythm of her work had slowed, not from fatigue, but from the weight of her thoughts, which wove together the threads of the past few days with the precision of a master weaver. The murder of Felix Durant, with its sharp blade and whispered motives, was a puzzle nearing completion, and Miss Marple's sharp mind was tugging at the final loose ends. The breakfast table that morning had been a study in strange civility. Eleanor Hargreaves, ever the optimist, had tried to steer the conversation toward Lisbon's upcoming festival, but her efforts faltered against the group's unease. Colonel Blake's usual bluster was muted, his eyes fixed on his coffee as if it held answers. Clara Montero, her elegance undimmed, spoke little, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup with a restless energy. Sylvia Crane, still shaken from her confession at the Café de Luz, kept her gaze lowered, while Dr. Antonio Pereira maintained his quiet composure, his comments confined to polite murmurs about the weather. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had observed them all, her gentle smile masking the calculations behind her eyes. The discovery of the knife, reported by Dr. Pereira the previous evening, had sharpened her focus. Its slender blade, wiped clean of fingerprints, suggested a killer with both intent and caution. Sylvia's fiancé, Joel, with access to the cafe's kitchen, was a possibility, but Miss Marple's instincts leaned elsewhere. She recalled a Danefield case where a discarded weapon had pointed away from the obvious suspect, and her thoughts turned to Pereira himself. His claim of stepping out for a cigarette on the night of the murder, coupled with the unopened cigarette case she had noticed, raised a question. Why had he been in the alley at all? Miss Marple's mind returned to the motives she had uncovered. Felix's blackmail had ensnared Clara over her questionable Velasquez, Sylvia over Joan's smuggling, and likely Colonel Blake over the Goya sketch. But Pereira, with his reserved demeanor and medical expertise, was a less obvious target. She thought of a Danefield physician who had falsified records to protect his reputation, and wondered if Felix had uncovered a similar secret about Pereira. His access to surgical instruments and the precision of Felix's wound made the possibility compelling. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple proposed a walk to Eleanor, suggesting they pass by Dr. Pereira's clinic in the Bairro Alto. "I'd like to see more of Lisbon's daily life," she said mildly, her tone as innocent as a village spinster admiring a neighbour's garden. Eleanor, glad for a distraction, agreed, and they set out, the city's steep streets alive with the clatter of trams and the chatter of vendors. The clinic was a modest building, its facade painted a soft blue, with a discreet sign reading Dr. Antonio Pereira, Medico. Miss Marple, feigning a slight headache, asked to step inside for a moment's rest. Pereira, who was seeing a patient, greeted them with his usual courtesy, though Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his eyes. The waiting room was tidy, with medical journals neatly stacked, and a faint smell of antiseptic in the air. As Eleanor chatted with the receptionist, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a locked cabinet behind the desk, its glass door revealing rows of medical instruments. She thought of a Danefield chemist, whose locked drawer had hidden incriminating evidence, and made a mental note. Later, over tea at the villa, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation to Pereira's practice. "You must see all sorts in your clinic, doctor," she said, her voice soft. "I imagine a man like Felix Durant, with his curious nature, might have taken an interest in your work." Pereira's hand paused as he reached for a biscuit. "Felix was no patient of mine," he said, his tone even. "He was more interested in art than medicine." But his eyes, Miss Marple noted, held a guarded look, like that of a Danefield curate caught in a lie about church funds. That evening, Miss Marple telephoned Capitão Almeida, the police inspector, and shared her suspicions with the diffidence of one merely offering a suggestion. "I've no proof, of course," she said, "but Dr. Pereira's presence in the alley that night, and his access to sharp instruments, might bear looking into. Perhaps a search of his clinic would be prudent." Almeida, initially skeptical, agreed to investigate, perhaps swayed by Miss Marple's unassuming certainty. The next morning, he arrived at the villa with news. A search of Pereira's clinic had uncovered a hidden drawer in his desk, containing letters from Felix demanding payment for silence about falsified medical credentials. Pereira, it seemed, had obtained his license through questionable means, a secret Felix had exploited ruthlessly. Confronted at the villa, Pereira's calm facade crumbled. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said, his voice breaking as Almeida stood by, notebook in hand. "Felix threatened to ruin me, my practice, my life. That night I followed him to the alley to reason with him. He laughed, mocked me, and I lost control. The knife was in my coat, a scalpel from the clinic. It was over in a moment." The room was silent, save for Sylvia's stifled sob and Colonel Blake's sharp intake of breath. Clara's face was unreadable, her pearls gleaming coldly in the lamplight. Eleanor, pale but composed, looked to Miss Marple, who sat quietly, her knitting resumed as if nothing had happened. As Almeida led Pereira away, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that had emerged. Felix's blackmail had been a dangerous game, pulling at the threads of greed, fear, and shame until one had snapped. She thought of a Danefield scandal, where a blackmailer's demands had ended in a similar tragedy, and felt a quiet satisfaction that the truth had been laid bare. Lisbon's whispering streets had spoken, and she had listened. Chapter 8. The Return to Danefield. The morning sun bathed the villa on Rua das Sombras in a golden glow, softening the shadows that had lingered over the past week. Miss Jane Marple stood in her guest room, carefully folding her sensible dresses into her modest suitcase. Her knitting bag, ever her faithful companion, lay packed with a half-finished scarf in pale blue wool, its neat stitches a testament to the quiet hours spent unravelling the tangled threads of Felix Durant's murder. The air was lighter now, the oppressive weight of secrets lifted, though the villa's inhabitants moved with the subdued grace of those recovering from a storm. Eleanor Hargreaves, her eyes bright despite the strain of recent events, insisted on accompanying Miss Marple to the airport. Over a final breakfast of coffee and Pont d'Amelio, she marvelled at her friend's acuity. "Jane, you're a wonder," she said, her voice warm with admiration. "To think you saw through it all. Pereira, of all people. I'd never have guessed he was capable of such a thing." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "People are much the same, Eleanor, whether in Danefield or Lisbon. They weave their lives with patterns of ambition, fear, and pride. One only needs to spot the loose thread to see the design." Her tone was gentle, but her words carried the weight of experience, honed by years of observing the small dramas of village life. She thought of a Danefield grocer who had seemed the soul of kindness until his jealousy led to a betrayal, and saw in Pereira's quiet desperation a familiar human failing. The other guests, now cleared of suspicion, had begun to regain their composure. Colonel Blake, his bluster restored, had spoken of returning to his golf club in England, though Miss Marple noted a new humility in his manner, perhaps born of relief that his own secrets, whatever they were, had not been the fatal thread. Clara Montero, her elegance unshaken, had thanked Miss Marple with a cool nod, her sharp eyes betraying a grudging respect. Sylvia Crane, freed from the shadow of Felix's blackmail, had confided her plans to marry João, her nervous smile replaced by a tentative hope. Miss Marple had patted her hand. thinking of a Deanfield girl who had found happiness after a similar escape from scandal. As the taxi wound through Lisbon's cobbled streets, Miss Marple gazed out at the city, its terracotta roofs and shimmering targus, a vivid contrast to Dainfield's quiet lanes. The whispering streets, as Eleanor had called them, had indeed spoken of greed, fear, and desperation, but also of resilience. Felix Durant's death had been a dark knot in the city's tapestry, but its unravelling had restored a fragile balance. Miss Marple thought of a Dainfield murder, solved by a single overheard remark, and felt a quiet satisfaction that her observations had served Lisbon as well. At the airport, Eleanor embraced her warmly. "You must come back, Jane," she said. "Lisbon will miss you, and so will I." Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her hat. "Perhaps I shall, Eleanor. There's always another story to hear, isn't there?" The flight to London was smooth, and the train to Dainfield passed through familiar fields, their autumn hues a soothing contrast to Lisbon's vibrancy. As she unlocked her cottage door, the scent of lavender and polished wood welcomed her home. She settled into her parlour. Her knitting resumed, the click of her needles a steady rhythm against the ticking mantel clock. Outside, the village green was alive with the small dramas of Dainfield life. Mrs. Bantry scolding her terrier, the vicar hurrying to a meeting, a young couple whispering by the postbox. Miss Marple's eyes, as sharp as ever, scanned the scene. Lisbon's mysteries had been resolved, but Dainfield, she knew, held its own secrets, waiting for a keen observer to unravel them. She thought of Felix Durant, his sly charm undone by his own greed, and of Pereira, whose quiet life had unravelled under the weight of a hidden shame. Human nature, she reflected, was a universal pattern, its flaws and virtues as clear in a Portuguese alley as in an English village. As she worked her wool, a new stitch forming with each careful motion, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity. The next loose thread, she knew, was never far away, and her needles, both literal and figurative, were ready to pick it up.